So, Adam, basically what we have been trying to uncover over the course of the last year is who wrote the Bible. I have no idea what the answer is, and I don't know that we're any closer, at least for Barbara Freeman's sake. But what we've been looking at essentially, and what I gave you, is that the version of the Torah that you have has a color-coded arrangement of the text based on some theories that perhaps different people or individuals put together, compiled, redacted, and then kind of made whole the text of the Torah as the way we know it. So we've been looking primarily over the last few weeks at texts that were written by or attributed to the priests, in particular the priests through the line of Aaron, the Aharonic priests, as opposed to priests through the line of Moses, the Mushite priests. Some of you probably didn't even know that there were such a thing as Mushite priests. There are actually even more priests, but we're not going to go into that. And what we're going to look at over the course of the next hour, maybe next week as well, is some of the stories starting in chapter, what did I say, 9 or 10? 9? Of Numbers that start to weave in other narratives that will then lead up to the wandering in the wilderness. So in the Friedman book, I'm on 255. In the Chumash, I'm on page 819. And what I mostly want to start with is I want to start with verse 15, which is page 256, sorry. In Friedman, it's page 821 in the Red Book. And there's this weird insertion in the text that is going to begin at least marking the wanderings that will happen in the wilderness. Everything that happens up until this part in chapter 9 is what's called Pesach Sheni. Did you know that there was a second Pesach? In case the first one wasn't enough. What's Pesach Sheni?
Second Pesach.
Yes, second Pesach. That's good too.
In case you missed the first one.
In case you missed the first one, exactly. So literally a month later, after the first Pesach, is the second Pesach. And the idea is, and by the way, we should all advocate for this in our Jewish tradition, right? Rather than all of the prep and the hullabaloo and the cleaning the kitchen and the buying of the stuff at Lucky's and Molly Stone's or whatever, that we need to then observe for 7 days or 8 days. If you missed it, specifically if you missed what?
The Seder.
No Seder
Eating
in
the
the story.
matzah.
Blowing of the shofar.
Blowing no? No, if you missed the sacrifice of the Paschal offering, okay, you had an opportunity to do a makeup. When? A month later. So a month later, they're introducing this idea of the Pesach Sheni, the second Passover, and guess how long it lasts for?
1 day.
1 day. 1 day.
I like that.
I know, right? It's a good deal. But you only get to do it if you miss the first one.
Oh.
Right, I know. Most people don't remember to skip the first one to get to the second one because they've already inundated themselves with the preparation. But randomly, after that whole thing finishes, we have this weird insertion in the text, which is all about what happens when they wander in the wilderness. Specifically, the Israelites are given 2 things to guide them in the wilderness. What are the 2 things? That's right, the cloud, right, which you can get on your Apple iPhone or on the Droid. And in the cloud, what do they have?
The ark.
Right, the pillar of fire, which happens when? At nighttime. And during the day, it's a cloud. And what does the cloud do? It tells them where to go and when to camp and when to stop and when to go. And it also serves as a source of protection. That's right. And we have that idea. Where else do we have the idea of protection in a cloud?
When Moses goes up to Sinai.
Yeah, there's like a cloud over Mount Sinai, yeah? Well, we have it in 2 ways. One is that you can buy Google storage, and that protects all of your stuff in the cloud. I don't think that's what they meant. But no, actually, it's the sukkah. Right? The rabbis in the Talmud, they debate, is the sukkah actually a sukkah the way that we build it, or is it ananei hakavod? Is it God's glory in the cloud? As if to suggest that the cloud served as a perpetual sukkah, a perpetual structure that helped protect the people while they were wandering. Because really, what was the sukkah for? Why did we build the sukkah?
Protection.
That's true, but protection, right? They built the sukkot in the wilderness as a form of protection, at least according to the story in the Torah. So, yeah.
But there's another concept of protection.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of it because I'm going to Bethel and I read an email from the rabbis and the cantor. And it said, first step in dealing with this refugee crisis, first step, pray. So prayer is thought of as a protection. You
Right.
know, when somebody is sick, oh, I'll pray for them.
Right.
So that's
But you all know the story about prayer, right?
the second line in the email that we got. First pray, second, go do something.
Right. But you know the story about prayer, right?
And the lottery?
And the lottery?
Yeah.
Oh, no. That's, yeah, but that's a similar story, right? I told that joke a couple years ago on Yom Kippur, right? The idea that the elderly woman, you know, she's praying to God that she wants to win the lottery, and she prays and prays and prays. She wants to win the lottery, Finally, on Yom Kippur, she goes before the ark, and she says, God, please, I want to win the lottery. I'm praying, I want to win the lottery. To which God, in the middle of Yom Kippur services, says, fine, so buy a ticket. Right? Okay, but it's the same story of, you know, the town by the lake and the levee breaks and it starts to flood the town and, you know, they come through in the canoe and they say, get in, right? You know that story?
Yeah.
That's right. So God, you know, the person drowns and goes to heaven. He says, I prayed, I'm pious, you know, why didn't you save me? He says, I sent you a canoe and a helicopter. What do you want? Okay. So all I wanted to at least highlight for this passage is that it's not a normal insertion, meaning it doesn't fit with the text. It's a random insertion, and Friedman highlights it and calls it actually a redacted text. Why do we think it's here? We think it's here because of what's going to happen next, which is they're about to begin their wandering. So before they begin their wanderings, they create an insertion which seems to be random as a way of saying that in their going out, they will have this protection at night and during the day. But other than that, it doesn't really seem to fit with the narrative. And so now what I want to look at is the actual beginnings of the traveling. So turn to chapter 10, verse 28, which is on page 825 or 258. Because on the one hand, what we have is that God is going to guide the people. Cloud by day, fire by night. But in verse 28, again with the redaction, we have a shift from the priestly tradition to the J tradition. And it looks like that the person or the thing that is going to guide the people is actually not God at all. And so now we get to look at a little comparative study of what's going on in the text. So, Barbara, would you mind reading, starting with verse 28 on 825 or 258, through the end of the chapter, please?
These were the orders of travel of the children of Israel by their armies when they traveled. And Moses said to Hobab, the son of Ruel the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, we're traveling to the place that Yahweh said, I'll give it to you. Come with us, and we'll be good to you, because Yahweh has spoken of good regarding Israel. And he said to him, I won't go, but rather I'll go to my land and to my birthplace. And he said, don't leave us, because you know the way we should camp in the wilderness, and you'll be eyes for us. And it will be when you go with us that we'll do good for you in proportion to the good that Yahweh will do for us. And they traveled from the mountain of Yahweh 3 days' journey. And the ark of the covenant of Yahweh traveled in front of them 3 days' journey to scout a resting place for them. And Yahweh's cloud was over them by day as they traveled from the camp. And it was when the ark traveled that Moses said, Arise, Yahweh, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee from your presence. And when it rested, he said, Come back, Yahweh, the 10,000s of thousands of Israel.
Okay, great. So let's unpack this for a moment. Let's start in verse 28. Verse 28 seems to be this transitionary verse, which is talking about what's going to happen when they go out. Now, we just had a chapter earlier that when they go out, what's going to guide them? A cloud or a pillar of fire. But verse 29 introduces a character by the name of Hobav, who is the son of Reuel. He is a Midianite, and he is Moses' father-in-law.
With a different name.
With a different name. Great. Who is he?
Yeah.
Yitro.
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 But why do we call him Hobav, the son of Reuel?
Well,
What do we know about Yitro?
he was a priest in a different. I forget the background, but
That's
he was
correct.
a priest.
He is a priest from a different background, a Midianite priest.
Midianite,
By the way, who writes this story? Jay writes this story, right? Barbara used a translation of Yahweh in the text. And what's interesting about Jethro, which we're going to look at in a moment, is that he was perhaps someone who at least acknowledges Yahweh's existence. It's not clear if he fully believes in him as his God, but he at least acknowledges we'll get to it, the power of Yahweh in the role of the story of the Exodus, which we'll look at in just a second. And what is it that Chovav is going to do? What is he asking him to do?
Scout.
To scout. He wants him to be his eyes. Literally, go and show us how to get there. V'hayita lanu le'einayim. Be for us our eyes in the wilderness. All right, so hold for a moment where we are here in the book of Numbers, and I want you to turn back to chapter 3 of Exodus.
Are you going to address the name change? Okay.
Yeah.
Where
But this is the
it?
cool part of comparative study.
Okay.
Page 326 in the red books,
121.
and in the other books,
121.
chapter 3 is 120, 121. There's one random sentence at the very beginning of chapter 3, right before the story of the burning bush, that introduces Moses and his father-in-law. It says, Moshe haya ro'eh et son Yitro chotno kohen mijan. He was the person who tended the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro. Okay, that's the very beginning. And according to Friedman, who wrote that particular verse?
E.
E, the Elohist tradition. How do we know? There's one very important phrase that tells us that it's an E tradition.
Elohim.
El Har HaElohim Choreva. In the E tradition, Mount Sinai was not called Mount Sinai, it was called Chorev. And it says it is the mountain of God with the name Elohim. So that's the opening of chapter 3. If we go back just a little bit, why is it that Moses goes to Midian in the first place?
He's running away from Egypt.
He's running away from
Killed the
Egypt.
Egyptians.
Okay, so turn back a couple of pages to 324 to chapter 2. Verse 15. It's on page 121 or 324. Pharaoh finds out what Moses has done in killing the slave. 324. He sought to kill Moses, so Moses flees from Pharaoh, and he arrives in the land of Midian. He sat down beside a well, and now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water, filled the troughs, but the shepherds came, drove them off, so Moses came to their defense. And when they returned to their father, verse 18, what is his name? Reuel. Why is it different? I'm on page 325, or page 121. What does Reuel mean?
It may mean friend of God,
Ooh,
according to the note.
you are correct.
What
It
was
may
it?
mean
The name
friend of
friend of
God.
God.
Which God?
El.
The God of El.
Yeah.
But, who wrote this particular portion?
No?
Oh, this one?
Yeah,
Jay.
J.
Yeah.
back here.
Which is the same as the reference we have later to the guy named Chovav ben Reuel Choten Moshe. So when we first meet Jethro, his name isn't Jethro. It is Reuel. He has 7 daughters, and it says in verse 18, Vatavona el Reuel avihen, they go to their father Reuel. How is it that you came back so soon? He said, there was an Egyptian who rescued us. By the way, how do the daughters of Jethro think about Moses? As an Egyptian. One of the things that we often debated about Moses was, who was he? Was he an Israelite, born to Yocheved and Miriam? Or was he an Egyptian raised in the house of the daughter of Pharaoh?
Well,
And by the way, who names Moses? The daughter of Pharaoh names him Moses because he was drawn out, Mishitihu, he was drawn out from the river. Yeah.
So I was just thinking about this, that how would they know that he was an Egyptian? It would be by his clothing, probably. right?
Probably.
So,
And his language.
you know, huh?
And his language.
Oh, in his language.
That's
yeah,
right. That's right.
I think it was
And
both,
Sarah.
actually.
He might have been both. Right? It kind of goes back to that discussion we had about the midwives. Were they Hebrew midwives or were they midwives of the Hebrews? Okay, so there's a clear question or an unclear question that needs to be answered about his identity in terms of how they perceive him. But at this point, Moses is not connected to God. It's not until the next page when Moses has the whole experience at the burning bush where he meets God. So at this point, Reuel, meaning friend of God or friend of El, might suggest that Reuel was a priest that worshipped El, or at least some other god that's not Yahweh, up until this point, in early Exodus.
The Hebrew name or a...
It's a great question. Is Moses a Hebrew name or an Egyptian name?
Egyptian.
It's probably an Egyptian name that they make a Hebrew pun out of.
Because the name of pharaohs were like Amuse and Ramuse.
Right.
And it's an Egyptian name.
And Namaste, yeah.
Yeah, Damas.
Okay? By the way, look at verse 21, or verse 20, yeah, verse 21. It says that Moses says he's going to stay, and he has he's given a wife named Tzipporah, and then we're told that he has a child named Gershom. Why? He's named Gershom because Ger Hayiti Be'eretz Nochriya. I was a stranger in a strange land. Who's the stranger and in which land?
Moses
Moses.
was a stranger in Midian.
No. Well, Joseph was a stranger.
Huh?
Joseph was a stranger.
So Joseph was also a stranger. It could be that he's a stranger in Midian, meaning he's Egyptian and now he's in Midian, or that he's a stranger because he is now estranged from his land altogether. He doesn't really know where he is. Right? And the next story that's going to happen is the whole story about the burning bush.
Although it's interesting because he's given his name to his son,
Yes,
who's not a stranger.
that is correct. By the way, as a stranger, a couple of chapters later in chapter 4, as they're heading back to Egypt, we have this weird scene where there's an angel that comes and tries to kill him and his son in the middle of the night because he hadn't circumcised his son. Would Moses have known to circumcise his son if he was Egyptian?
No.
Yeah, they circumcised.
Perhaps, but again it goes back to the question of when Pharaoh's daughter sees the baby and opens him up and she says that he was Hebrew, how is it that she recognized he was Hebrew? Okay, so it's an interesting question. I'm just throwing it out there. Turn now to chapter 18 of Exodus. Chapter 18, where this is the first chapter at the beginning of Parshat Yitro,
Yeah.
which is the same chapter when we get the Decalogue, when we get the Ten Commandments.
it says
ironic,
to
too.
Jethro.
It's page 432 in the Red books, and in the Friedman books, it's chapter 18, page 149. And you should notice pretty clearly in Friedman who writes chapter 18. E writes chapter 18. But notice the other two times we've had references to Jethro, it was
J.
J. Okay? So, now let's see what happens in chapter 18 because it's going to get a little bit weirder. Okay? In chapter 18, Barbara, would you mind reading we're going to read from chapter 18 verse 1 through verse 12.
Okay, let me read from my red book.
Yeah, let's read from the Red book because this way we can stay consistent with the language.
Jethro, priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt.
Okay, so I want to pause you for 1 second. In verse 1, what names of God do we have?
Elohim.
We have both.
Ah.
Vayishma
Adonai.
Yitro Kohen Mijan, Choten Moshe. Yitro, Jethro, the priest of Midian, the father-in-law of Moses, hears all of the things that Elohim did for Moses and Israel, his people. Ki hotzi Adonai et Yisrael miMitzrayim, because Adonai, Yahweh, took him out of Egypt. So if we really wanted to try to make things complicated and confusing, let's throw all of the possible names with multiple authorships for each of the different times that we have references to Jethro, and just kind of say, we hope that you figure it out. Okay, keep going.
So Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after she had been sent home, and her 2 sons, of whom one was named Gershom, that is to say, I have been a stranger in a foreign land, and the other was named Eliezer, meaning the God of my father was my help, and he delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh.
Okay, so I'm going to pause for a second so that Barbara can catch her
I'm
breath.
going to get a drink of water.
Okay, get a drink of water. But what I want to highlight for you is that we have what's called a doublet. What is a doublet?
Two stories.
We have 2 stories from 2 different traditions that we have repeated in the text. We just looked in chapter 2, which was when Moses and Zipporah meet, they get married, and they have a child named Gershom. And here again, we have a retelling of the story, but in chapter 2, it was written by J, and in chapter 18, it was written by E. Okay, so if you ever have one of those moments when you're sitting in synagogue one week, you're like, oh, that's really interesting, and then a couple weeks later, you're like, didn't I read that already? This is one of those moments where we literally feel like we're having biblical deja vu.
But they're both telling the same story.
Yes, but from 2 different
That's
authors.
important.
It is important. Why is it important?
Because it gives us some context and some validity.
Yeah,
And
But-
that from 2 different areas, they're telling the same story.
good. But it's also saying to us, we have to ask the question, why? Why is it telling me the same story twice? If you already told it to me once, isn't that enough? Which I say that to my mother all the time, but she still repeats. Oh wait, that was on video. Wait.
But
All
they're,
right,
not,
but-
they're not going to be the same stories.
Why are they not going to be the same story?
Because again, you're taking them from 2 different perspectives.
Good. So what's the perspective of a J tradition versus the perspective of an E tradition?
One's more L-centric and one's more Yahweh-centric.
Good. So one is more the god of El-centric, which is a Canaanite, non-Yahwist god, and one's more Yahwist, but let's talk about it politically for a moment.
The north versus.
Yeah, it's northern versus southern.
Right.
Okay, do we see now how we're starting to pull all of the different pieces of what we've been talking about over the whole year together a little bit? So what politically is going on here that would make us want to say that this is a northern tradition as opposed to the other one a southern tradition?
I can't read this fast enough, but I would suspect the personality of Moses is different
Yeah?
in the story from the north.
Okay, that's true.
Different personality.
Well,
Phil?
The Elohists don't have Yahweh until Moses, so they have to spend a lot of time talking about the origins of Yahweh.
Good.
The Yahwists have always had Yahweh.
And here's the cool part. This is the dawn of Yahwism because 2 chapters later, what do we get?
we get
The
the,
name of God, right?
we get the
Yeah.
We get the 10 Commandments.
Right.
And how does the first commandment go? Anochi Adonai Elohecha. I am the Lord. I am Yahweh, your God. It's a perfect setup. We don't really have Adonai Yod-Heh Vav-Heh yet officially, even though Moses has been introduced to it. Jethro doesn't know it yet. We're going to see in a second that maybe he does know it. Okay, but up until chapter 20, we don't have an official proclamation to the people of who this God is in a very overt and commanded kind of way. Barbara, you okay to keep reading?
Probably better to have some.
Okay, someone else want to keep going? Go ahead, Ziva. So we're gonna go back to verse 5, page 433 at the top. Verse 5.
Verse 5.
Jethro.
Okay, 5. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought Moses' sons and wife to him in the wilderness, where he was encamped at the mountain of God. 6. He said word to Moses, quote, I your father-in-law Yitro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons. 7. Moses went out to meet his father-in-law. He bowed low and kissed him. Each asked after the other's welfare, and they went into the tent. Keep going?
Yep.
8. Moses then recounted to his father-in-law everything that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardships that had befallen them on the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. 9. And Jethro rejoiced over all the kindness that the Lord had shown Israel when he delivered them from the Egyptians. 10. Quote, "Blessed be the Lord," unquote, Jethro said, quote, "who delivered you from the Egyptians and from Pharaoh, and who delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians." 11. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods. Yes, by the result of this very schemes against the people. Unquote. 12. And Moses and Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices for God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to partake of the meal before God and Moses' father-in-law.
Okay. So this is before the whole scene that's going to come up where Moses seeks advice from Jethro, or Jethro offers advice to Moses about how to set up the courts. But before this all happens, we have this weird interaction with Jethro, with Yitro. By the way, he's not called Reuel here. He's not called Chovav here. He's called Yitro. And it's all about Jethro doing what?
It's elevating the Hebrew God.
That is correct. It is elevating which Hebrew God?
El.
No.
Is it Adonai?
It is Adonai.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, so let's take a look for a second. Go back to verse...
10.
Let's start with verse
Even
8.
Yeah.
Vayesaper Moshe lechotno. Moses tells his father-in-law everything. Kol asher asa Adonai leFaro uleMitzrayim. Everything that the Lord did to Pharaoh and Mitzrayim. All of the signs and all of the wonders, everything that had happened to them. Vayatzilem Adonai. And Adonai saved them. Vayichad Yitro al kol hatovah. Jethro literally rejoices, right? He almost attaches himself to God and to what he does, specifically to Adonai. Asher asa Adonai Yisrael, asher hitzilo miyad Mitzrayim. He literally connects himself to Adonai, to Yud Hey Vav Hey. Vayomer Yitro, verse 10, Baruch Adonai. Blessed is Adonai. Asher hitzilachem miyad Mitzrayim miyad Pharaoh, who saved him from the hands of Egypt, from the hand of Pharaoh, because he saved them from underneath the hand of Egypt. Atayadati. Now I know, ki gadol Adonai mikol ha'elohim. I know that Yud Hey Vav Hey is greater than any other El. Mikol ha'elohim, from all of those El gods. Ki badavar asher zadu alehem, because of all of the scheming, yada yada yada. So what does Jethro do? Vayikach Yitro chotem mishne olah uzvachim leElohim. Now it gets weird again. Jethro takes a sacrifice and offers it to whom? To Elohim. Vayavo Aharon v'chol zignei Yisrael. He invites all of his peeps. Im chotem Moshe lifnei ha'Elohim, to partake in the meal before Elohim.
It's just so confusing.
Huh?
Because
What is
it's-
going on here?
Because it's also written by E,
Yeah.
and so it's even more confusing if it's been written by E
Uh-huh.
put in here.
It's written by E, by a guy named Jethro, who before was called Reuel, who later is called Chovav. Chovav, by the way, means the one who desires, who
That's
loves.
his son.
That's an interesting question.
That's what
Yeah.
it says.
Hold on. We'll get to Chovav in a moment, because we actually have Chovav elsewhere, and there are references to that Chovav, and there's a midrash that says that Jethro had 7 names. including Chovav, including Reuel, including Yitro, including Yether, and a few others. Okay, so it's not clear. Is the guy in our story later the same dude that was in the story earlier, or is it his son, or maybe even his grandson? It's not clear.
Well, maybe what he's doing is he still believes in his God, I mean, other gods, but he is recognizing that this is the greater God.
Yes.
But he, it's almost like, you know, when you feel badly that you're demoting your, the God that was your main God.
Yep.
And
Can I jump in?
also, he's not rejecting Elohim.
Yeah.
He's just saying Adonai is greater.
Right. Phil, and then Stan?
So let me jump in and defend Yitro. So there's another political entity in this text, and this is why I think it seems confusing. There's the Egyptian origin of Yahweh. So extra biblical sources, the first reference to Yahweh is in Egyptian text, and they talk about the Shasu of Yahweh. And they know that this was a coppersmithing area. These guys were like rocket scientists of the day, because you think you got to go dig something out of the ground, you got to know the color, you have to build a furnace, you have to melt it, you have to mold it. I mean, that was like, you know, rocket science back then. So Yitro was a Yahwist, is what most scholars believe. And they believe that the origin of Yahwism was in this region through extra biblical and internal biblical sources. And the other kind of thing which is interesting is the Druze. You're familiar with the Druze? So the Druze's chief prophet is Yitro, and they consider him to be the hidden prophet, and they consider Moses to be the revealed prophet, because Yitro revealed Yahweh to Moses, and Moses saw the bush, and then, you know, Yahweh became the God of Israel. But he originated outside of Israel.
And if you want to support that theory, all you have to do is go back to chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3. Before Moses has the experience at the burning bush, go back to chapter 2 for just a second. Before Moses has this whole big thing at the burning bush where he meets Yahweh for the first time, what ends up happening? He runs to Jethro.
Okay.
324 and 325. And in running to Jethro, who wrote this part of the story, according to Friedman? He says it's a J narrative, which is a Yahwist narrative. It's almost as if to suggest that when he went to Jethro, that maybe he actually encountered the idea of the Yahwist God, and then immediately that which follows is Moses' first encounter with Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. When does that happen? At the burning bush. What the author does in chapter 3, though, is the author connects Yahweh back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. As if to say, no, this is not something that Jethro just made up on the spot here, or just came to know. This is actually something that has been connected to our tradition since the time of the patriarchs. I have been there all along, and I am the one who will take you out of Egypt. There's a sequencing that happens in the story that would seem to suggest that it's not until Moses runs from Egypt, comes in contact with Jethro, who, by the way, is not called Jethro in that story. He's called Reuel, the friend of God, the priest, that friend of God introduces Moses to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. And so it's an interesting character development that's happening in the story, and the J-E back and forth is a tension that we're trying to unpack as to who is writing and for what purpose. What's the goal in mind? Interestingly enough, after the Exodus, Jethro, writing from an E tradition, is once again reintroducing or elevating God's name. But in this case, we use Jethro as the name, not Reuel. So each name of Jethro seems to kind of track a different part of the journey in Moses and the Israelites coming to know Yahweh, which is what Phil is trying to suggest.
There's one more thing I want to throw in.
And then we'll go to Stan and Ziva.
And now Yahweh is the first God ever created that isn't in the land, because Yahweh is revealed in Sinai and not in Israel. Yet it becomes the God of Israel. Whereas El's always in the land. It's you either have the God of Syria or the God.
Right. So there's a difference between what we'll call regional gods and gods that transcend space and time. Well, if you remember back to the story of Jacob and his ladder, Jacob lies down, he has the dream, the angel's going up and down the ladder, and Rashi, the French commentary, he suggests that that represents the changing of the guard. Meaning, Jacob was worried that his God would not go with him into the new land. And at that time, it was the God of El, because that place will be called Beth El. If you want its full name, it's actually Peninsula Temple Beth El. Okay? And so, what this God is being introduced as is a God that transcends that space and time and goes anywhere, wherever we are. And actually, to make it more poignant, we learn about it outside of the land, and then what is the goal of Yahweh afterward? To get us back to the land. Okay, Stan and then Zebra.
Just simply that these are monolatrists and that they believe in the existence of
Will you
many
remind
gods.
everyone what monolatry is?
It's a belief that there are many gods,
Yes,
but that there is one God who reigns supreme.
that's right. And that's supported in what Jethro says in chapter 18. Yeah, Baruch Adonai. Praised is Adonai. That God is greater than all other gods. I've learned that. But now that we've acknowledged that, I'm going to go back and offer a sacrifice and we'll have dinner to my God.
Right, and it would be consistent with that idea
Yes.
that, yeah, his God is El,
Right.
but Moses' God is
Right.
Adonai.
Exactly. And what you also are starting to see is a tension between this idea of Judaism or Israelite theology as monotheistic, meaning only one God, versus monolatrous, which suggests that there are multiple gods, but one God is above the rest, namely Yud-He Vav-He, Adonai, Yahweh. Did everyone follow all that? That was kind of
Yeah.
circuitous. You did?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Do they have that other
Are you being serious?
I'm sorry. Do they have that other religion as well, that they have all these gods where there's one that reigns supreme?
Hindu.
Yeah, there's a lot of religions that have, yeah. I mean, even think about Egyptian theology, Greek theology, Roman mythology. They all have many gods, but there's usually Zeus. But Zeus actually has a different manifestation in Greek and in Roman, right? You've got in Egyptian it's Ra, and in Greek, and you got Zeus, and so.
One thing that's confusing about this is in the Orthodoxy, the Orthodoxy rabbinate pretty much doesn't acknowledge that the Torah is describing a monolatrous. They retro ex post kind of assert that it's all monotheism. But if you take a look at Herschel and the Rambam and the Rashi, they recognize that that it goes through a monolatrous
The
phase.
challenge with acknowledging monolatry is that it takes away from authority. And so part of what our Orthodox theology is contending with is this idea that if we want to say that the Torah is the most authoritative text, and it's representing the Word of God, then we can't create any ambiguity, historically speaking, that there might be more than one. That would, kind of borderline enter us into discussions around idolatry.
So how do they rationalize this? That there are different names. Do they just say they're different names?
They're different names
The
that
same
represent
things?
different attributions or aspects of
Okay.
God. If you remember, for those of you who were here when Rabbi Druin came to speak, he talked about how Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are different manifestations of the same God through different names, and that we're not introduced to certain attributes of God, namely like compassion, until after creation happens. Right? So each one is about revealing a different aspect of God when we're ready to receive it or when we're trying to explain something different in the story.
There's another description that I hear, which is they're all the same God, but it's different paths towards observance. So if you're an Elohist, then the way that you observe God is to say He's above and I pray for things and He delivers beneficence upon me. And the other way of observing God is to do good acts, and by
Right.
your acts good things happen. That it's not a different God, it's
Right.
just a different path of
And a great
observance.
example of that is High Holiday Liturgy. High Holiday Liturgy invokes so many different names of God, right? You've got Avinu Malkeinu on the one hand, God as parent, God is king, God is sovereign. You've got Adonai, Adonai El Rachum Echanu, God is compassionate and forgiving and slow to anger, yada, yada, yada. And then you also have the God of Unatana Tokef, right? The God of judgment. Who's going to decide who lives and who dies? It's almost like it's all the same God, and here are different manifestations of that God through different understandings of those attributes. Yeah.
But if we're going to go back to the political and the E versus the J, it's startling to have an E source talk about God as the, Jethro in an E source saying that God is the most powerful one. When that would be the God, when their God is El in the northern kingdom and they're fighting the
Right.
southern kingdom of Sezet Sodomoi.
Unless not everyone in the Northern Kingdom believed in that.
Well,
I mean, they were at one
well-
point united as one.
Right.
And by the way, just because that they worshipped one God didn't mean that they didn't acknowledge or they were not aware of
Other
other gods.
monolatries.
Right. And by the way, it's okay because who is the person talking? Jethro. So even though it's representing an E or Northern tradition, he's Midianite.
So you can discount what he says.
Well, you can apologize
We try
in a
to
way.
clobber the Midianites and say they're bad guys later on anyway.
But that's one of the most complicated stories in the entire Torah. I think more than any other killing is this random, what would seem like attack and wiping out Midian after all of the familial stuff that happens before. Ziva and Ellen.
When you said biblical deja vu, I thought that was brilliant. It sounds like the title of a book. So that got my...
I'll write it.
Yeah, I think not only should you write it, but Ann and I just came from a class with Rabbi
Maybe.
Levy, and it was it was like the same kind of topic. It was fabulous. And when you talked about Yittro's, what's his other name?
Chavav, Reuel.
Reuel, the friend of God, it called to mind the role of the angels. They're just friends of God. They don't decide anything. They just are messengers.
Yeah.
So I'm always wondering why both were put into the Torah at, when it was finally, like, why these doublets, why these clear, whoever was putting together had to realize these conflicts. So, I get back to the point of why they both in the text.
Are you asking about Jethro's names, or are
Yeah,
you asking about
right, because
Adonai versus El?
Well, like Jethro, and these changes. It must have been obvious as this is being put together that this was happening. And, I don't understand if it was just because perhaps the people from north or the south, these were names that were familiar, and so by not including it, it would have been an issue for people to accept. I still puzzle over that.
Trying
Is
to
Reuel's
please
a
everybody.
name, or is it just a description of who he is?
It's an interesting question.
That's what names were then.
Yeah,
What does
but the name
Jethro
also reflects, what does Jethro mean? It comes from so there were two names that were related to Jethro. Yitro, and one called Yeter. I forget if it's like that or if it's with two. But Yeter means the one that remains, or the remnant, if you will, right? Or the additional one.
What
And
word
it's
do we know that's related?
Yoter,
Yoter.
like more, right?
Oh, yeah.
But you can make the argument that the reason why the vav is tacked onto it is that it's a form of that, right? It's a way of bringing a Yahwist element into it, right? We have that a lot, like Eliyahu, Elijah. He was a Yahwist, right? Yeshayahu. Isaiah, he was a Yahwist. They would put the names of their gods in a way, as opposed to this.
Yeah.
Yisrael, El is an Elohist name.
And then you have Elijah, who
Sure.
just can't figure out where he's going to live.
Well, a lot. That's right. But my point is that the names often say a lot about the deity that they're associated with.
Right.
Not always, or they represent political or geographical things, right? So sometimes they represent You know, Isaiah and Jeremiah are prophesying in the southern kingdom around the time of the destruction of the first temple, as opposed to Micah and Amos, who are prophesying in the northern kingdom. So, what are they prophesying against in the northern kingdom? They're prophesying against idolatry. And so, you know, it makes sense that they don't have Yahweh's names, but they don't have overt El names either, right? Because they're prophesying against. But you can do lots of things with the name game.
They're complaining against sacrifices.
Say it again?
They're complaining about sacrifices.
They're also complaining about sacrifices to El and are advocating for changes of behavior. So,
One more thing to respond to what Ellen said, because I struggle with that too. And I think there's one way through it, is Yahweh is a proper name. Like my name is Philip. Yahweh it's a proper name. It's not a theophoric name. Elohim it can be used as God, just with a little
God
g.
generic.
Yeah, or God's generic, and because Hebrew doesn't have capitalization, you have to determine it through context. So I think I did read somewhere that at some point there were a lot of mass changes of incidences of Elohim to Yahweh in the existing text, where somehow the scribes knew this use of Elohim is referring to Yahweh, so we'll do that replacement. And then they retained the Elohim when it was used, just, we should pray to God without using
So,
the name.
we're coming to the end of time. Next week will be the last class for 2 weeks, because I'm going to be at Camp Ramah. But I want to just look at the very end of chapter 10 with everyone next week, which is another text that's different from what we did before about the idea of the cloud and the fire.
Interesting questions.
This one actually makes the argument that it wasn't the cloud and the fire that went in front of them to protect them, but it was the ark. And it becomes the text in verse 35, Vayhi binso ha'aron vayomer Moshe kuma Adonai. It's the opening of the Torah service, which is this idea that the ark would go out and guide them on their journey, spreading apart or scattering their enemies, and then whenever they settled, the ark would return to the center of camp. So we'll look at that briefly, and then I want to look at the story.
That's Numbers 10?
That's the end of Numbers 10, and then we're going to look at 11 and 12, which is the story about Moses with his siblings, and then move into the story of the spies, the scouts. Okay?